There is an oft-repeated tale from our Unitarian history, which I am about to repeat yet again, of the writer Henry David Thoreau, who in 1846 famously refused to pay his poll taxes, and for this was ignominiously arrested and jailed in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, by 1846, Thoreau had been failing to pay his taxes for a little while now, 4 years actually, as an act of deliberate civil disobedience in opposition and protest to the United States' support of slavery. In 1846, he continued to not pay his poll tax, but now it was also in opposition to the Mexican-American War, which seemed to him to be a deliberate plot to expand the reach of American slavery into the Southwest, which of course it was. Mostly the local officials had been ignoring his tax delinquency, but when he publicly spoke out against the war in 1846, it angered the powers that be. One of those powers that be was Concord constable and tax collector Sam Staples, who interrupted Thoreau while he was out on a walk and asked him, "Are you going to pay the back taxes?" Thoreau refused and was promptly jailed. He spent the night in the Concord jail, and then someone unknown to him paid his back taxes, and the next day he was released. He was furious. Not about the jailing, but that he was released. And the entire episode became the occasion of his famous essay now known as Civil Disobedience. The episode is well known, and you can read it in a million places, including, of course, Thoreau's essay himself. I'm indebted to massmoments.org, the Constitutional Rights Foundation, and historyofmassachusetts.org for some of the little finer details in that story. So there's an apocryphal story connected to Thoreau's stint in jail that the famous transcendentalist essayist and philosopher and one-time Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Thoreau in jail, and surprised to find his friend in such a state, he said with exasperation, "Henry David, what are you doing in there?" To which Thoreau is said to have replied, "Ralph Waldo, what are you doing out there?" Which is a solid burn that sadly, in all probability, never actually happened. But the anecdote does serve to reinforce two misconceptions. One, it presents Thoreau's act of civil disobedience as rather unique or unprecedented, so much so that Emerson could not grasp it. And it reinforces the idea that transcendentalist philosophers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, and by extension the other transcendentalists, were either too apolitical or too timid or too dreamy to engage with the world around them. So author Peter Wirzbicki takes aim at both of these misconceptions in his 2021 book, Fighting for the Higher Law, Black and White Transcendentalists Against Slavery. And he shows in the book how, first of all, there was a robust tradition of civil disobedience going on in Boston long before Thoreau stopped paying his poll tax. But this civil disobedience was taking place in the free Black community of Boston, not among white intellectuals, and it was resistance to slavery. Now, Boston, of course, was free, but the law written into the Constitution in 1787 was that enslaved people could be seized and returned into slavery even when on free soil. The federal government, in practice, mostly left it for the agents of Southern slavers to carry this out. And it was left to Black people in the North to organize resistance against those Southern agents. So, for example, in 1827, John and Sophia Robinson, African Americans, were jailed for 4 months because they refused to hand over a 5-year-old Black girl to her white guardians because they were afraid those guardians would sell her into slavery in the South. Another example, in 1836, Wirzbicki writes, a group of Black women pulled off a daring rescue of 2 Maryland fugitives, meaning escapees from Southern slavery, when one of the women restrained a court officer while a throng of Black women burst into the courthouse and whisked the 2 fugitives away to freedom. In their practice of resistance to immoral law, Black activists and abolitionists were creating a fertile ground for a theory of civil disobedience that transcendentalists like Thoreau would later fully articulate as a right of conscience, as a right of obedience to a higher law. And this idea that one had a moral duty to resist unjust human laws in service to a higher law then provided spiritual support for further acts of resistance in sort of a feedback loop. And over the course of their resistance to slavery, the abolitionists and the transcendentalists became dialogue partners on the imperative for social transformation. Now, I learned that there was actually considerable interplay between Black intellectuals and white intellectuals in Boston in the 1830s, when transcendentalist writers like Emerson and Thoreau were beginning to experience their public acclaim. I had not really heard until I read this book about the existence of Black transcendentalists, but there were in fact many African-American intellectuals in Massachusetts who were pursuing and popularizing their own version of transcendentalist and, by extension, Unitarian ideas. And they were serving as a bridge between white and Black intellectual communities in Boston. One example I want to name is William C. Nell, who was instrumental in founding a literary society for Black Bostonians called the Adelphic Society. And he invited speakers like Emerson and Unitarian minister Theodore Parker to come give talks at the club to Black audiences. The clubs, of course, were segregated. Nell promoted a concept he called elevation, which had strong overtones of the Unitarian concept of self-improvement through education and discipline. But he was particularly interested in the transcendentalist ideas about spiritual freedom and dignity. Because the transcendentalists believed that each person possessed the power to uncover moral and spiritual truths through their own intuitions, that each of us has a divine spark, a divine light within us that gives us access to a vision of the higher law, of the divine truth, of the way things could be, ought to be, might be. And the common sense philosophy of the day said that people's minds and people's thoughts were actually shaped by the sensory inputs of their surroundings in a materialist way, and thus people's understanding was in some sense trapped by their circumstances. And the transcendentalists said no. Each person, regardless of their environment, is free to discover their own truth and shape their own spirit and claim their own destiny. And not only were people free to do this, it was their highest calling as human beings to do this. And so the transcendentalists urged people to cast away any conformity to the status quo and to cast a bold vision for their life based on the highest ideals of morality and truth that every person had access to. And Black thinkers who were attracted to transcendentalism appreciated the dignity that this afforded all people, that the divine spark was within them, and they appreciated the spiritual freedom in this vision of humanity, that no one could be held back by their upbringing or their surroundings or their circumstances. And then they pushed the transcendentalists to walk their talk, saying, if you truly believe that life was to be shaped by the highest ideals available to the human spirit, if you truly believe that all conformity to convention is a degradation of the spirit, then how are you going to respond to the evils of slavery that are all around you? And in 1830s, the transcendentalists were a little slow to answer that question. They preferred to remain in the realm of theory and critique. But as the 1830s moved into the 1840s and the slavery issue began to heat up, it became harder and harder to remain in the realm of theory. And as more and more of the wealth and well-being of the society around them in Massachusetts was based on cotton coming up north, inaction was seeming more and more like complicity. Meanwhile, more and more fugitives, formerly enslaved people, were making their way north, pursued by Southern agents. By the 1840s, Black anti-slavery activists in Boston had organized groups that they called vigilance committees or freedom associations that existed to aid fugitives from slavery who made it to Boston. So these groups would provide economic support, they would get people jobs, they would help defend and protect them from Southern kidnappers who were on their trail. And in doing so, their work both cleared a path for enslaved Black people to flee north, giving them hope, and then they protected them once they arrived. And Wirzbicki notes that even as transcendentalist thinkers like Thoreau were working out what he calls the intellectual scaffolding for a moral defense of civil disobedience, even as Thoreau was thinking the thoughts that were eventually going to lead him to stop paying his poll tax as an act of civil disobedience, Black activists had long before made forms of resistance, including civil disobedience, a practice. So as abolitionist sympathies spread, more and more white activists began to join these vigilance committees. And originally, these societies pledged to protect fugitives by any legal means available to them. Until 1850, there was no legal requirement for a private citizen in the North to cooperate with a Southern kidnapper. But then, after the passage of the infamous Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it became illegal for citizens in Boston to interfere with slave agents who were kidnapping runaway enslaved people and returning them back to their enslavers. So in response to this law, the Fugitive Slave Act, a furious group of Black activists founded a new society, the Boston Vigilance Society. And at its founding, they were now quite vocal about their willingness to disobey the law. And disobey the law they did, doing everything in their power to hide and protect fugitives. Like its predecessors, the Boston Vigilance Committee had both Black and white abolitionists as members. For example, the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker was a member of its executive committee. And the experience of Black abolitionists and activists and intellectuals was a powerful influence on the Transcendentalists' understanding now of civil disobedience. They ultimately translated this at last into action. Wirzbicki notes that almost every significant Transcendentalist you could care to name was involved at some point with the Vigilance campaign. Ralph Waldo Emerson regularly interacted with them, donated money to their legal defense funds, vociferously criticized the Fugitive Slave Act in public. Henry David Thoreau went further, regularly actively performing illegal actions like harboring fugitives. Theodore Parker, the Unitarian minister, went still further. He was said to write his sermons with a pistol in his desk drawer, so he could, if he needed to, protect the fugitives he was sheltering in his church. Later on, he was one of the secret six who funded John Brown. By 1854, the Boston Committee had assisted more than 230 fugitives, and they would continue to operate until the end of the Civil War. Sometimes their actions were dramatic. In 1853, for example, they learned that a fugitive was being held on a ship in Boston Harbor, and so a group of men, Black and white, found the ship, boarded it by force, and seized and freed the captive. Legally, it was an act of piracy. On another occasion in 1855, members of the committee impersonated U.S. officers in order to seize a fugitive from bounty hunters and then escort him to the Canadian border. Members of the Vigilance Committee, Wirzbicki says, also fought slavery on an ideological level. They produced pamphlets, speeches, books, poems. And among their most important products, he notes, were Theodore Parker's sermons and Henry David Thoreau's essays, which laid out a clear moral case for the kind of civil disobedience they were engaged in, and calling their fellow citizens to become a part of it. Wirzbicki writes, as white thinkers sought to make sense of their new inclination to break the law, they saw in the actions of black activists, as well as in the bravery of the fugitives they were protecting, a model for principled disobedience. And out of this interaction between white and black activists arose a civil disobedience theory that Wirzbicki says would inspire generations to come. And that phrase, generations to come, is not hyperbole or just airy praise. Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, about that one night in jail, which was not particularly well read in his day, would go on to inspire both Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so the interchange between transcendentalist theory and abolitionist practice became an important catalyst for two of the greatest civil rights revolutions of the 20th century. We never know how far the reach of our ideas and actions will be. Thoreau didn't know when he was penning that essay that he was touching off a revolution in India and later America, but he was. The Transcendentalists' role in the struggle against slavery as spiritual leaders and as activists is part of our living tradition of Unitarian Universalism. And one of the things that I find inspiring about them was their willingness to cast a bold vision for society. The Transcendentalists were sometimes criticized as being airy and undisciplined dreamers. And they were, as a group, considered the long-haired hippies of their day. And it was true that they could vanish up their navel with the best of them. And as a group, they can lay claim to more than a few failed communes that were probably not good ideas to begin with. A famous joke of the day said, Transcendentalists were people who soared into the infinite, dove into the illimitable, and never paid cash. There is some truth to that, and you can read Louisa May Alcott's simultaneously hilarious and horrifying account of growing up as a child on the Fruitlands commune, if you want examples of this. But the Transcendentalists were also people unafraid to follow their moral and spiritual critiques of their society well beyond obvious and comfortable reforms into a bold and dramatic reimagining of what it is possible for us as humans and for us as a society. Maybe at its silliest, it looked like poorly founded communes or abstract poems about God and nature, but at its best, it looked like people literally putting their bodies on the line in the service of human freedom and casting ideas that helped empower generations of oppressed people to shake off their oppression, resist tyranny, and claim their essential dignity as human beings. So today, a growing number of Unitarian Universalists are taking that same spirit of bold imagination and committed activism and bringing it to what is called the modern abolition movement. The abolitionist movement of today, of the 21st century, takes its name and its inspiration from that great struggle for freedom and human dignity that ended chattel slavery. But what it aims to dissolve today is the prison system, the modern carceral state. Modern abolitionists see in the carceral system an utter failure of both society and humanity. They point out that America is the most incarcerated country in the world per capita, the most incarcerated country in the world, with almost 2 million people, or 1% of the adult population, locked up at any given time. They name the deep impact of racism in shaping mass incarceration and in determining who gets imprisoned in America. And they try to imagine a world without prisons. What would safe and healthy communities look like in a world without prisons? What would restorative justice look like? What would reparations for past harm look like? Can we imagine such a thing? Can we imagine the steps that would be needed to even begin to move towards such a world? Now, this sermon can't go into all the details of the modern abolitionist movement, which is diverse and complex. As you can imagine, there are many different ideas about what a world without prisons could look like. There are many different ideas about how to get there. And as you can imagine, there are many concerns, questions, challenges, objections, problems. To just say the words, "a world without prisons," is to cast about as bold and improbable a vision as you possibly could. And it is not my purpose today to advocate for that vision, but I want you to be aware that this is part of modern Unitarian Universalist discourse, linking the proud abolition of our past with the work of abolitionism today. So if the boldness of that vision, a world without prisons, excites you, then know that you can connect with many other people right inside this religious tradition who are also excited by that vision and that possibility. More concretely, the UUA's Side with Love campaign has identified decriminalization as one of their 4 priorities for their national social justice organizing. So if you want to connect with and organize with other UUs from around the country who are taking practical steps to reduce incarceration and to imagine alternatives, you can do that too. Just Google UUA Side with Love. There's an incredible wealth of resources online and many well-organized opportunities to begin volunteering right from your living room. Now, the UUA's other priorities include climate justice, protecting democracy and gender justice, including protecting reproductive freedom. And today, as we face the continued unraveling of reproductive freedoms around our country, growing efforts to criminalize LGBTQ people, as we experience the impact of the runaway climate change and the continued abuses with policing and the mass incarceration system, we may want to wrestle, as the Transcendentalists did, with our own convictions about the time and place and limits of civil disobedience. We may want to wrestle with the question of our own comfort with civil disobedience. It is part of our religious heritage as UUs to wrestle with this question. The Reverend Teresa Soto, a UU minister who is also trans and a person of color, says, "I cannot prove to you that I am human, but you can hold my hand. The answers I have," they say, "are about our courage to love and to get each other free, unashamed that there came a day that we were willing to risk looking foolish to simply stay together and alive. There were those who came before us, who cast a vision so bold as to risk looking foolish, and they had the courage to attempt to live into it. May we, in our own day, in our own way, be so bold and so courageous." Blessed be